The graveyard shift at the old Marlow textile mill was Arnold's sanctuary. It was a tomb of silence, a place where the clamor of a world he no longer understood faded into the low, steady hum of a single, under-budgeted transformer. For 12 years, he had patrolled these same cavernous halls, his heavy steel-toed boots echoing a lonely, deliberate rhythm on the cracked concrete floor. The mill had died in the late 70s, a casualty of cheaper labor overseas, and now it stood as a dusty mausoleum to a forgotten era, smelling of rust, old oil, and decay. Arnold liked it that way. The solitude was a balm. The rows upon rows of looms, shrouded in yellowing white cloths, were like a sleeping army of ghosts, but they were predictable ghosts. Their stillness was a comfort. They didn't ask for much. He'd do his rounds at 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., and 4 a.m., a simple, unvarying circuit that took him from the echoing, chemical-stained dye rooms in the West Wing to the silent, spinning jennies in the East. In between, he'd sit in his small, glass-walled office, a fishbowl in a sea of darkness, reading dog-eared paperbacks and drinking lukewarm, bitter coffee from a dented thermos. The first oddity was small enough to be dismissed, a minor tear in the fabric of his routine. A heavy steel door in the shipping department, one he specifically remembered locking and rattling to confirm, was ajar on his midnight round. Not wide open, just cracked by an inch, as if someone had peeked out and not quite clicked it shut. He grumbled, annoyed at the implication of his own failure. He slammed it, the sound booming in the vast space, and made a mental note to check the perimeter for any signs of vagrants trying to find shelter. He found none. The chain-link fence was intact, the gates secured. It had to have been his own mistake. A week later, it was a sound, a faint, melodic humming that seemed to snag at the very edge of his hearing. It was so soft, he initially thought it was the wind whistling through a broken window pane high in the rafters. But there was no wind that night. The air in the mill was thick, still, and heavy with the scent of dust and decaying wood. He stopped, tilting his head, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. The humming, delicate and childlike, seemed to come from the main loom floor, a vast chamber where hundreds of the shrouded machines stood in silent, orderly formation. As he stepped through the archway into the room, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was deeper, more profound and watchful than before. Arnold was a man of logic, of cause and effect. He believed in faulty wiring, drafts, vermin, and the tricks an overtired mind could play. He did not believe in ghosts. But the logical explanations were starting to wear thin, each one a thread snapping under a growing tension. One night, while staring blankly at the bank of grainy black and white CCTV monitors, he saw it. A flicker of movement on camera 4, the one aimed down the long expanse of aisle 7 on the main floor. He leaned closer, his face inches from the screen, his brow furrowed. He rewound the digital recording, the timeline bar jumping backward. Play, stop, rewind, play. There. For a fraction of a second, a small, dark shape detached itself from the shadows of one shrouded loom and slipped behind another. It was too quick to be human, too fluid. A stray dog? A large rat? He replayed it a dozen times, squinting, trying to resolve the pixels into something recognizable. But the image was too distorted, too fleeting. It just looked wrong, its movement impossibly smooth. His 2 a.m. round felt different that night. The air was colder, a damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather and clung unpleasantly to his uniform. He walked with more purpose now, his heavy maglite cutting a nervous, sweeping path through the oppressive shadows. As he entered the main loom floor, the humming started again. This time it was clearer, less ethereal. It was undeniably a child's voice, a little girl humming a simple, haunting lullaby he couldn't quite place. It was coming from the far end of the chamber, somewhere near aisle 7. "Hello?" Arnold called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud and thin in the immense space. "Anyone there? The mill is closed." The humming continued, unwavering, a delicate thread of sound in the crushing silence. A knot of ice formed in Arnold's stomach. He was a man of routine, of predictability. This was not part of the routine. This was an intrusion. He began to walk slowly down the central aisle, his light beam bouncing from one shrouded machine to another, making the cloth figures look like hunched, waiting things. "This is private property," he said, trying to inject an authority he did not feel into his voice. "If someone is in here, you need to leave now." He reached aisle 7 and turned into it. The humming was louder here, seeming to come from the very air around him. And that's when he saw her. At the very end of the aisle, a little girl stood with her back to him. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with long, dark hair that fell in a straight, neat curtain to her waist. She wore a simple, faded cotton dress, the kind he hadn't seen since blurry photographs of his own childhood. She was the source of the humming. A wave of illogical relief washed over Arnold, quickly followed by a tide of confusion. "Hey now," he said, his voice softening instinctively. "How in the world did you get in here, little one? Are you lost?" The girl stopped humming. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Arnold had ever heard. It was a physical pressure, a weight in the air that crackled with unspoken energy. Every nerve in his body, every instinct honed by years of solitude, screamed at him to turn and run. Slowly, deliberately, she began to turn. The movement was unnatural, hideously fluid, like a doll on a rotating stand. First her head, then her shoulders, then the rest of her body, all without the slightest shift in her feet. When she finally faced him, Arnold's breath caught in his throat like a shard of glass. Her face was pale, a bloodless porcelain white that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her lips were blue and slightly parted, but it was her eyes that broke him, that shattered his logical world into a million pieces. They were 2 dark, cavernous pits. Not just dark, but empty. Empty sockets that seemed to drink the powerful beam from his flashlight, pulling in the light and giving absolutely nothing back. It was like staring into a dead universe. He stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the radio on his shoulder. His fingers felt like sausages, numb and useless. The girl began to move towards him, not walking but gliding. Her feet, clad in worn leather shoes, hovered an inch above the grimy, oil-stained concrete floor. The radio hissed in his ear. He couldn't form words. He was frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated terror. She was 10 feet away. The cold intensified dramatically, and he could see his own breath fogging in the air in thick, panicked plumes. A whisper slithered directly into his mind, a voice that was both young and agelessly ancient, filled with a sorrow that was bottomless. "He left me." She raised a small, translucent hand and pointed a single, accusatory finger, not at him, but at the huge, rusted industrial loom just to his right, the one with the faded number 73 painted on its side. Suddenly, the lights in the entire mill flickered violently, buzzing and popping. The hulking machine, silent for decades, groaned to life with the shriek of protesting metal. Gears shrieked, ancient leather belts whirred and slapped, and the deafening rhythmic clack, clack, clack of 100 looms, weaving phantom threads filled the air. The sound was a physical assault, a mechanical pandemonium that vibrated through the floor, up his legs, and into his bones, shaking the very foundations of the building. The spectral girl opened her mouth, and a silent, agonizing scream contorted her pale features, a scream he felt in the deepest parts of his soul. Arnold finally found his feet. He turned and ran. He didn't look back, but he could feel the coldness, the bottomless despair of those empty eyes boring into his spine like a drill. He ran harder than he had in 30 years, a wild, primal flight through the strobing, flickering corridors, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cacophony of the spectral factory floor chased him, echoing down the halls. He burst through the main doors into the cool, gray light of the approaching dawn. He didn't stop running until he was in his car, fumbling with the keys, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. He drove away, tires squealing, and never looked back. Arnold quit that morning. He told his boss he was sick, his voice a hoarse whisper. He moved to another city a month later, seeking the noise and crowds he had once fled. But the mill never left him. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is quiet and the world outside is asleep, he can hear it. The faint, melodic humming of a lost little girl, and he sees those eyes, those endless, empty pits, in every dark reflection. And he knows with a certainty that chills him to his very soul that she is still there, waiting in the silence for someone who will never come back. The final metal shutter of the department store rattled down, its clang echoing through the cavernous marble halls of the Blackwood Galleria. The sound was unnervingly final, a metallic tombstone sealing away the day. Francis, a man whose weary face was a roadmap of 2 decades on the night shift, jangled the master keys, the tiny teeth of metal scraping together in the vast quiet. All tucked in, he grunted. He turned to his partner, Oscar, who was a decade younger and still had the nervous energy of a stray cat. "Just us and the mannequins, kid." Oscar didn't answer. He was staring down the long, polished concourse towards the food court. By day, this place was a riot of noise and life. The sizzle of frying oil, the cheerful jingle of a smiling burger mascot, the endless chatter of shoppers. But now, under the cold, sterile glow of the security lights, it was a dead landscape of stacked chairs and dark, gaping storefronts where shadows pooled like black water. The chilly autumn air hung heavy with the smell of floor wax and something else. Something old and musty, like disturbed earth. "Hey, you feel that, man?" Oscar whispered, his breath misting slightly in the unnatural cold. "The air. It's heavy tonight. It feels watchful." Francis clapped him on the shoulder a little too hard. "That's the $2 coffee from the machine, Oscar. It's always watchful. Come on, first sweep." The Blackwood Galleria was one of the older malls in the county, built in the late 80s on a sprawling plot of land that old-timers claimed was once a colonial-era cemetery. Francis dismissed it as folklore, the kind of spooky tale told to scare children. But as they began their patrol, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking a lonely rhythm on the tiles, even he had to admit the place had a personality after dark. The storefronts were like countless unblinking eyes. The mannequins, frozen in chic, impossible poses, seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, their painted-on smiles malicious in the shadows. Their first hour was marked by a suffocating routine. Check the service corridors, rattle the fire exit doors, log their progress. It was on their way back past the Little Angels Children's Boutique that the night's rhythm began to fracture. From inside the darkened store, a faint sound drifted out, a delicate, tinkling melody. "What was that?" Oscar froze, his hand instinctively going to the small cross he kept in his pocket, his knuckles white. "A music box," Francis said, his own voice tighter than he wanted. He shone his powerful flashlight through the glass. The beam illuminated a pristine display of frilly dresses and tiny patent leather shoes. In the center, on a velvet pedestal, sat a porcelain ballerina music box. It was perfectly still, its tiny dancer poised and motionless. Probably a faulty spring. Old building, old wiring, old everything. He didn't believe it. The power to all stores was cut from the central grid precisely at 10:30 p.m. He knew because he flipped the breakers himself. The music had been too clear, too deliberate. They continued their walk, but the silence that followed felt different. It was a listening silence, as if the entire mall was holding its breath, waiting for their next move. As they rounded the corner into the West Wing, a blast of Arctic cold air hit them. The wing was being renovated, a dead end of plastic-draped scaffolding and bare concrete. "Jesus!" Oscar shivered, his teeth chattering. "Air conditioning must be leaking Freon." But there was no air conditioning unit in this section. The cold was unnatural, localized to a single spot. As Francis swept his light across the floor, he saw it. A small, wet footprint, the size of a child's, glistening on the dusty concrete. It was perfectly formed and utterly alone. There was no second print, no trail leading to or from it. Before he could stop himself, Francis reached down. The air around the print was freezing, and when his fingers touched the mark, A pain like 1,000 icy needles shot up his arm. He snatched his hand back with a curse, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Let's go," he said, his voice strained. "Now!" They hurried away, but the feeling of being watched was now a physical presence at their backs, a pressure against their necks. The whisper started as they approached the grand atrium. At first, it was just a faint hissing, like radio static on the edge of a signal. Then, it coalesced into soft, sibilant murmurs that seemed to come from the air vents, speaking in a language that was almost English, but archaic and distorted. "Did you hear that?" Oscar asked, his face pale as chalk under the fluorescent lights. "It sounds like they're talking about us." Francis nodded grimly, his hand resting on the heavy mag light on his belt. "We stick together. Radio anything unusual." They decided to head for the central security office on the second floor. As they reached the main escalators, all of them dormant for the night, the one directly in front of them groaned to life. With a horrific clatter of metal on metal, its steps began to ascend into the oppressive darkness of the upper level, grinding like broken bones. Both men scrambled back, their hearts seizing. The escalator ran for a full minute, its clanking echoing like a factory of nightmares, before shuddering to a violent halt. That's it!" Oscar panted, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm calling the supervisor." He fumbled for his radio, but only a burst of angry static answered his call. "Dead! The signal's dead." Suddenly, the mall's PA system, silent for hours, crackled to life. But it wasn't an announcement or the usual cheerful mall music. It was the faint tinny sound of a woman humming a lullaby, a sad, melancholic tune that scraped at the edges of their sanity. They abandoned the escalators and took the stairs, taking them two at a time. The humming followed them, echoing through the stairwell, seeming to come from just behind their shoulders. When they finally burst onto the second floor, they ran for the security office, a small glass-walled room overlooking the atrium. Francis fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the lock. They tumbled inside and slammed the heavy door, locking it behind them. The room was their sanctuary, a brightly lit island in an ocean of encroaching darkness. A bank of 16 CCTV monitors showed them the mall's dead, silent spaces. For a moment, there was nothing. The humming had stopped. The mall on the screens looked just as it should, empty and still. "See?" Francis breathed, a wave of relief washing over him. Maybe a power surge, a massive one. Oscar wasn't listening. He was pointing a trembling finger at a monitor in the bottom right corner. Camera 14, the West Wing renovation site. The camera's view was grainy, but the image was unmistakable. A figure was standing in the exact spot where they had found the footprint. It was a woman in a flowing, old-fashioned white gown. A woman in white. Her back was to the camera, her long black hair obscuring her features. She stood perfectly still. As they watched, paralyzed, she began to turn. Slowly. Impossibly slowly. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a film being played frame by agonizing frame. "Don't look," Oscar whispered, shielding his eyes. "Don't look at her face." But Francis couldn't look away. The woman's head continued to turn. It passed the point where a human neck should have stopped, turning and turning, the sound of cracking vertebrae seeming to transmit through the monitor itself. Finally, her face came into view. It was a pale, luminous mask of pure hatred, her eyes black pits of despair, and her mouth a rictus of a scream that made no sound. Then, she looked directly into the camera, directly at them. Every monitor on the wall simultaneously flashed to static. The lights in the office exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging them into absolute terrifying darkness. The only light was the red glow of the emergency power button on the console. A high-pitched scream tore through the silence, a woman's shriek of unbearable agony that seemed to come from right outside their door. It was followed by a soft, wet thud against the glass. Francis and Oscar huddled together behind the console, barely breathing. A pale, contorted face was pressed against the glass of the door, its features distorted by the pressure. Its black eyes were wide and its mouth opened and closed, fogging the glass. Then, a single perfectly formed handprint, identical to the one on the floor, slapped against the window, leaving a misty residue that began to trickle down the pane like a tear. A voice whispered, no longer from the PA system, but from the other side of the door. It was a chorus of suffering, the voices of the long dead whose rest had been disturbed. But one voice rose above the others, a woman's voice laced with a cold, ancient fury. "Open!" it hissed, the single word dragging out into an eternity. The door handle began to rattle violently. The metal frame groaned, bending inward. Francis knew the lock wouldn't hold. This was it. The stories were real. The mall was a tomb, and it wanted them to stay. The morning relief guard arrived at 6 a.m. to find the mall eerily silent. The security office door was wide open, its lock shattered, and the metal frame warped as if by a great force. Inside, the monitors were all static, the floor covered in shattered glass from the overhead lights. On the glass of the door, a single child-sized handprint was etched in the condensation. Of Francis and Oscar, there was no sign. They were never found. Sometimes, late-night maintenance workers at the Blackwood Galleria report, seeing 2 new security guards making their rounds. They walk in silence, their faces pale and their eyes empty, forever patrolling the dark, haunted corridors of their new home. The advertisement was unassuming, tucked between a plea for a lost cat and a used car sale. Night security guard needed. Moonlit market. Competitive pay. No experience necessary. For John, whose savings had dwindled to the double digits, it was a lifeline. He'd lost his construction job a month ago, and desperation was a cold, heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. The interview was odd, held in a cramped, windowless office that smelled of mothballs and stale coffee. The manager, a gaunt man named Mr. Abernathy, with skin like old parchment, didn't ask about his work history or references. Instead, he stared at John with watery, unblinking eyes that seemed too large for his skull. "Are you a heavy sleeper, Mr. Wallace?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle. "And do you have what one might call an overactive imagination?" John, eager for the job and unnerved by the intensity of the man's gaze, assured him he slept like a log and was as unimaginative as a brick. Mr. Abernathy's lips pulled back in a semblance of a smile. "Excellent." He hired him on the spot, handing him a set of heavy, old-fashioned keys and a single yellowed sheet of paper, brittle at the edges. "The rules," he'd said. "Follow them. Exactly. Your shift is from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Don't be late. The market doesn't like to be kept waiting." John's first night was deceptively quiet. The moonlit market wasn't a modern supermarket. It was an old, sprawling place with narrow aisles, buzzing fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly green hue, and a strange, lingering smell of dust, ammonia, and spoiled meat. He did his rounds, the silence broken only by the low hum of the massive freezers and the squeak of his own worn-out boots on the cracked linoleum. Back in the security office, he read the rules, chuckling to himself. They were absurd. 1. After midnight, do not look at your reflection in the security monitors for more than a few seconds. 2. You will occasionally hear a shopping cart rolling down aisle 7. Do not investigate, it is just browsing. 3. The butcher's corner at the back of the store is to remain locked after 11 p.m. If you hear any noises from behind the door, turn up the volume on the store's radio. 4. There is a mannequin in the seasonal aisle. It sometimes moves. Do not acknowledge it. It doesn't like being watched. 5. If a child's laughter is heard near the candy aisle, go to the break room and lock the door for 10 minutes. Do not come out sooner. He dismissed them as a bizarre prank on the new guy. By his third night, however, the laughter was gone, replaced by a knot of cold dread in his stomach. It started subtly, with things he could almost explain away. A can of peaches he'd just restocked was on the floor, dented as if from a fall, a shadow in his peripheral vision that vanished when he turned. Then, he started noticing the mannequin. It was a cheap plastic thing, dressed in a faded summer dress, advertising a long-gone brand of lemonade. Its wig was slightly askew, and its painted eyes had a vacant, glassy sheen. The first time he saw it move, he blinked, thinking his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had left it at the end of aisle 3, facing the front. Now, it was 3 feet to the left, its head tilted slightly, its painted smile seeming wider, sharper. He checked the security cameras, his heart starting to thud. The footage for the last 10 minutes was pure, fizzing static. A few nights later, around 2 a.m., the unmistakable sound of a single shopping cart, one with a wobbly, squeaking wheel, began to echo from aisle 7. It rolled slowly, deliberately, stopping for a moment, then starting again, punctuated by the soft thud of items being placed gently into its wire basket. Every instinct screamed at John to go and see who was there, to confront the intruder. But Mr. Abernathy's second rule flashed in his mind. It is just browsing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to stay in his small office, his eyes glued to the monitor for aisle 7, which inexplicably remained empty and still. The fear truly took root the night he heard the noise from the butcher's corner. It wasn't loud, just a soft, wet, rhythmic. It sounded like someone methodically chopping meat, punctuated by a faint, wet tearing sound. He remembered rule number 3 and fumbled with the old radio, cranking up a crackly talk show until it drowned out the sound. But he couldn't drown out the image it planted in his mind. A heavy cleaver rising and falling in the dark, bloodless room. A coppery metallic smell began to seep from under the door. John was beginning to unravel. Sleep offered no escape, filled with nightmares of rolling carts and wide, painted smiles on plastic faces. He was jumpy, irritable, and the feeling of being watched was a constant weight on his shoulders. He tried to quit, but Mr. Abernathy just gave him a thin-lipped smile, a cash bonus for diligence, and a chilling reminder that good jobs were hard to find. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was just after 3 a.m. when he heard it. The clear, joyful giggle of a small child coming from the candy aisle. It was so out of place in the suffocating silence that John froze, every hair on his body standing on end. Rule number 5, go to the break room, lock the door. 10 minutes. He didn't. He couldn't. This was different. This was a child. What if a kid had wandered in and gotten locked inside? His duty as a security guard, as a decent human being, outweighed the store's insane rules. Flashlight in hand, he crept out of his office. The air grew colder as he approached the source of the sound. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The giggling answered him, closer this time, right at the end of aisle 5. It had a manic edge to it now, less joyful and more hungry. He moved towards it, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The aisle was a riot of colorful packaging, gummy bears, chocolate bars, lollipops. But there was no child. Then he saw it. On a low shelf, a single bag of jelly beans had been torn open. A small, sticky handprint was smeared on the shelf next to it, glistening under his light. It was a fresh print, and it was wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin, ending in points that looked sharp. As he stared, a single jelly bean rolled out of the bag and fell to the floor with a soft tick. A floorboard creaked behind him, a sound like snapping bone. He spun around, his flashlight beam wild. The mannequin was standing there, not 10 feet away, right in the middle of the aisle, blocking his path. Its head was no longer tilted. It was craned all the way back, staring at the buzzing lights on the ceiling. As he watched, its plastic neck emitted a series of soft cracks, and it slowly, impossibly, lowered its head to look directly at him. Its painted smile was a grotesque gash in the plastic of its face, and a dark, oily tear seemed to be leaking from the corner of one glass eye. John scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing into a shelf of cereal boxes. His flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, before settling on the mannequin's feet. They were bare, plastic feet, planted firmly on the linoleum. But a step away from them on the dusty floor were a fresh set of footprints. Small, bare, and decidedly not plastic, leading away from the mannequin and into the darkness. Panic, pure and absolute, seized him. He forgot the rules, forgot his job, forgot everything but the need to escape. He scrambled to his feet and ran He didn't head for the break room. He bolted for the front entrance. The giggling was all around him now, a chorus of unseen mirth echoing in the cavernous store, joined by the frantic, squeaking wheel of a shopping cart, impossibly fast, right behind him. The keys rattled in his hand as he fumbled with the lock. For a terrifying second, it stuck. He slammed his shoulder against the door, rattling the glass. The lock clicked open. He burst out into the pre-dawn air, gasping, the cool night air feeling like a slap. He didn't stop running. He ran until the sickly green glow of the moonlit market was just a memory, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. The next morning, Mr. Abernathy stood by the front door of the moonlit market, looking at the keys still hanging in the lock. He sighed, a dry, papery sound. It was always so hard to find good help that listened. He took out a small, familiar sign from under the counter and carefully taped it to the glass door. Night security guard. Needed. Competitive pay. No experience necessary.